Why America bought Alaska. In 1867, the United States bought a piece of land twice the size of Texas. It had almost no roads, no cities, and fewer than 1,000 American settlers. Critics called it a frozen wasteland, a foolish gamble, an icebox nobody wanted. They called it Seward's Folly. Today, that land produces billions of dollars in oil, sits at the strategic crossroads of 3 continents, and holds some of the richest natural resources on Earth. This is the story of how America bought Alaska and why one of history's most mocked decisions became one of its smartest. To understand why America bought Alaska, you first have to understand why Russia wanted to sell it. Russian explorers had claimed Alaska back in the 1740s, drawn by one resource above all: fur. Sea otters, in particular, were prized across Europe and Asia, and the Russian-American company built a fur trading empire stretching from the Aleutian Islands down into what is now Northern California. But by the mid-1800s, that empire was crumbling. Russian hunters had trapped sea otters to near extinction, and fur profits collapsed. Running a colony 8,000 kilometers from Moscow, across nearly the entire width of Siberia, proved brutally expensive. Then came the Crimean War. Russia fought Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire, and lost badly. The war drained the Russian treasury and exposed a terrifying vulnerability. Russia's navy was no match for Britain's, and Britain already controlled Canada, right next door to Alaska. Russian officials began to fear the worst. If another war broke out, Britain's powerful Royal Navy could simply seize Alaska outright, and Russia would get nothing for it. Better, they reasoned, to sell the territory to a friendly third party than risk losing it for free to a rival. That friendly third party was the United States. Tsar Alexander II and his advisors, including his brother Grand Duke Constantine, quietly began floating the idea of a sale as early as 1857. The Americans, still recovering from their own civil war, weren't in a rush. But Russia kept pushing. Enter William Seward, U.S. Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln and later under Andrew Johnson. Seward was a man obsessed with expansion. He believed the United States was destined to dominate trade across the Pacific, and he saw Alaska not as a frozen wasteland, but as a stepping stone, a foothold for future influence in Asia, and a way to box in British Canada from the north and west. In March 1867, Russia's minister to the United States, Edouard de Stoeckel, arrived at Seward's home late one evening with an urgent message. The Tsar had agreed to sell. Seward, ever eager, reportedly told Stoeckel there was no need to wait until morning. Legend has it a treaty was drafted that very night. By the early hours of March 30th, 1867, the deal was struck. The United States would pay Russia $7,200,000 for Alaska. That works out to roughly 2 cents an acre, an almost absurdly small price even by the standards of the time. You might expect Americans to have celebrated a bargain like that. Instead, much of the public reacted with ridicule. Newspapers mocked the deal mercilessly. Cartoonists drew Alaska as a barren icebox, a polar bear garden, a frozen wasteland good for nothing but walrus hunting. The press coined nicknames that stuck for generations: Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, even Andrew Johnson's Polar Bear Garden, poking fun at the unpopular president who backed the deal. Part of the backlash was political. President Andrew Johnson was deeply unpopular, locked in bitter fights with Congress that would soon lead to his impeachment. Any deal associated with his administration was an easy target. There were also genuine, if short-sighted, doubts. Few Americans had ever seen Alaska. It seemed impossibly remote, disconnected from the rest of the country by thousands of kilometers of Canadian territory. What possible use could it have? Despite the mockery, the U.S. Senate ratified the treaty by an overwhelming vote in April 1867. Seward's persistent lobbying and some old-fashioned political maneuvering helping carry the day. But there was one more hurdle. Congress still needed to actually approve the money to pay for it. That vote in the House of Representatives, in 1868, was closer and more contentious, tangled up in the era's poisonous politics. Rumors even circulated that Russian officials had bribed newspaper editors and lawmakers to build support. Eventually, the funding passed, narrowly, and the purchase was secured. On October 18, 1867, in the town of Sitka, Russian soldiers lowered their flag and American troops raised theirs. Alaska officially became United States territory. For years afterward, the region was barely governed. Congress didn't even grant Alaska formal territorial status until 1912, nearly half a century after the purchase. To most Americans, it remained a distant curiosity, a place of ice, indigenous peoples, and seals, far removed from national life. It's also worth remembering that Alaska was never Russia's or America's to sell in any true sense. Indigenous peoples, including the Tlingit, Inupiat, Yupik, and Aleut, had lived on this land for thousands of years, and neither the Russian nor American governments consulted them about the transfer of their homeland. Then, slowly, the mockery started to fade. In the 1880s and 1890s, gold was discovered in Alaska, feeding into the broader gold rush fever that swept the region alongside the famous Klondike strikes just across the border in Canada. Prospectors flooded north, and towns like Juneau and Nome grew almost overnight. Alaska's fisheries proved enormously valuable too. Then came the 20th century, and Alaska's true strategic value became impossible to ignore. During World War II, Japanese forces actually invaded and occupied 2 islands in the Aleutian chain, a stark reminder that Alaska sat on the front line between the United States and the Pacific. The territory became a crucial base for defending North America. During the Cold War, that strategic importance only grew. Alaska sits just a few dozen kilometers from Russia across the Bering Strait, making it a critical early warning outpost for tracking Soviet aircraft and missiles. And then, in 1968, came the discovery that changed everything: enormous oil reserves at Prudhoe Bay, on Alaska's North Slope. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline System was built in the 1970s to carry that oil hundreds of kilometers to port, and Alaska became one of the most oil-rich regions in the entire United States. Alaska formally became the 49th U.S. state in January 1959, cementing its place in the Union after nearly a century as a territory. So was it folly? $7.2 million in 1867 is a rounding error compared to the value Alaska has generated since, in oil, minerals, fisheries, and strategic military positioning. Economists and historians alike now regard it as one of the greatest real estate bargains in American history. William Seward himself never lived to see Alaska fully vindicated. He died in 1872, still remembered by many contemporaries mainly for the purchase that bore his name as an insult. It wasn't until decades later, as gold, oil, and geopolitics reshaped the map, that Seward's folly quietly became Seward's triumph. It's a reminder that history rarely delivers its verdict quickly. What looks like a frozen wasteland to one generation can become an irreplaceable asset to the next. America didn't just buy land in 1867. It bought time, position, and possibility, and it would take 100 years to discover just how valuable that purchase really was.